Have you ever wondered what it truly takes to change the course of history? Today, we journey back to one of World War II's most pivotal moments, a clash that would shape the fate of nations and test the limits of human endurance. But before we dive into this gripping chapter, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe to my channel, and ring the bell so you never miss out on stories that bring history to life. Now, let's step onto the shores of the Pacific in 1945, where the tides of war are about to reach their fiercest point. By the dawn of 1945, Allied forces had seized control of almost the entire Pacific, pushing the Japanese back. In March, U.S. Marines fought a hard-won and brutal battle to capture the small island of Iwo Jima. With the Japanese homeland now within striking distance, American leaders focused on Okinawa, a crucial stepping stone for the final assault on Japan, soon to become the scene of unimaginable carnage. The American approach of leapfrogging from island to island had brought their military ever closer to Japan's doorstep as World War II neared its end. Their next objective was the Ryukyu Islands, a chain of 161 islands dominated by Okinawa. U.S. strategists envisioned Okinawa as a vital base for launching a potential invasion of the Japanese mainland. Recognizing Okinawa's strategic significance, the Japanese had established a naval installation and 7 airfields on nearby islands. The island's geography favored defense. The north was rugged and filled with deep ravines, while the southern regions, though flatter, were dotted with limestone ridges and caves. The civilian population was sizable, with 435,000 residents, most living in the south. Yet these islanders were culturally distinct from the Japanese. Speaking the Luchuan language, they were often viewed as inferior by the Japanese garrison. To secure the loyalty of the local populace, Japanese authorities relied heavily on propaganda, fostering fear of the Americans and unwavering devotion to the emperor. American bombing raids beginning in September 1944 intensified the dread of an impending invasion. By early 1945, much of Naha, the capital, and its port lay in ruins. As the Americans readied their assault, the Japanese prepared both the people and the terrain for fierce resistance. Both armies saw the looming conflict as a fight for Japan itself, and their leaders watched closely, seeking clues about what an invasion of the home islands might entail. The Japanese defense was commanded by Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushijima and the 32nd Army, numbering around 100,000 troops of varying experience. The 62nd and 24th Divisions had fought in China, though the 24th lacked combat exposure. They were backed by the depleted 44th Independent Mixed Brigade. To offset losses, the Japanese conscripted airmen, naval personnel, and Okinawan locals. Between 17,000 and 20,000 civilians formed lightly armed militia units, while 2,000 teenagers, some as young as 14, were pressed into the Blood and Iron Student Corps. Though short on heavy weaponry, the Japanese had sufficient artillery and mortars. The Allies, however, arrived with overwhelming strength for Operation Iceberg. A force of 100,000 soldiers and 88,000 Marines, supported by 300 warships and 1,130 other vessels, along with air cover, prepared for battle. Admiral Raymond A. Spruance and his team chose a 12.8-kilometer stretch on Okinawa's west coast for the landings. Their plan was to seize the Kadena and Yantan airfields, then cut the island in two before advancing north and south. 17-year-old Japanese ammunition carrier Yagi-sei was awestruck by the sight of the massive U.S. Armada. The sheer size of the fleet left no doubt about the likely outcome. On March 29th, U.S. forces captured the Karamurato Islands and unleashed a barrage of 100,000 shells, rockets, and mortars on Okinawa's shores. The invasion was imminent, and American planners braced for heavy losses. They anticipated casualty rates as high as 85% among the first assault troops. At 8:30 a.m. on April 1, 1945, 2 Marine and 2 Army divisions stormed the beaches. Yet, as they landed, they encountered only scattered mortar and artillery fire. No machine guns, no Japanese soldiers in sight. Marine Eugene Sledge, a veteran of the Peleliu campaign, felt immense relief. The horrors of Peleliu had haunted him, but on Okinawa, the landings met virtually no resistance. Once their shock subsided, the troops broke into laughter and celebration, the release of tension unforgettable. Of the 50,000 Americans who landed, just 55 were killed or missing. This light toll was part of the Japanese strategy. General Ushijima chose not to defend the beaches, believing that U.S. firepower would annihilate his forces. Instead, his plan was to let the Americans advance onto the Central Plains, then wear them down in brutal battles along Okinawa's southern ridges. Light Japanese forces would harass the north, while the main body fell back to defensive lines near Suri Castle. Once the Americans were bogged down, Tokyo promised a massive air assault on the U.S. fleet. Still, Colonel Hiromichi Yahara remained doubtful. From the outset, Yahara recalled, they were isolated from Imperial headquarters. The troops joked bitterly, saying that headquarters staff would never come to Okinawa now that Naha's red light district had been destroyed in the bombings. American forces advanced for days with little resistance from inexperienced Japanese units. They secured the airfields by April 2nd, reached the East Coast by the 5th, and captured the Chatan Isthmus in the south. The island was now split, but as Marines moved north and the Army pushed south, Japanese resistance began to harden. Japanese soldiers and Okinawan irregulars started ambushing Marines in hit-and-run attacks, especially in the dense forests of the Motobu Peninsula. On April 4th, American forces encountered entrenched Japanese positions and were halted at Kakuza, Nishibaru, and Tombstone Ridges on the island's western side. The narrow approaches slowed the U.S. advance, but these tight corridors also exposed Japanese troops to devastating American artillery, resulting in severe losses for the defenders. For example, while inflicting 450 casualties on the U.S. 96th Infantry Division, the Japanese 63rd Brigade suffered approximately 5,700 fatalities. Japanese spirits briefly lifted on April 12th with the news of President Roosevelt's death, but the relentless combat showed no signs of abating. Driven to extremes, Japanese troops resorted to unconventional tactics. Colonel Kaya, known for his resourcefulness, emulated the legendary 14th century warrior Masashige Kusunoki by dropping human waste on enemy positions to harass the Americans. Despite such desperate measures, U.S. forces eventually broke through the Japanese defensive line, only to face fresh resistance at Haksa Ridge. With Army units exhausted, Marines rotated in to take their place. Major General Isamu Cho, noticing a slowdown in the American offensive, insisted on more forceful counterattacks, disregarding Colonel Yahara's advice. Cho's new offensive, launched on May 4th and supported by amphibious landings behind U.S. lines, also failed. From then on, Yahara's war of attrition became the prevailing Japanese strategy, though hopes for victory faded. Cho, resigned to defeat, even joked grimly with Yahara about the timing of his ritual suicide, having accepted responsibility for the failed counteroffensive. While the land battle became a grueling stalemate, a fierce struggle erupted at sea. Starting April 6th, Japanese kamikaze pilots launched relentless attacks against the U.S. Fifth Fleet. Inspired by earlier successes in the Philippines, these suicide missions proved more accurate and destructive than conventional air raids. The first wave of 355 kamikazes signaled a sustained campaign. By June, roughly 1,800 kamikaze sorties targeted U.S. ships and airfields on Okinawa. Though many were shot down, their massed attacks overwhelmed defenses. U.S. sailor J. Holmes later described the onslaught. "This was the granddaddy of them all. We didn't have time to count, but the records show the kamikazes came at us 10 at a time. As good as our gunners were, there was no way we were going to stop them all. By battle's end, kamikaze attacks had sunk 26 U.S. ships and damaged 225 more, causing 9,700 American casualties, the Navy's worst losses since Pearl Harbor 6. The kamikazes weren't the only threat. On April 6th, the massive Japanese battleship Yamato sailed for Okinawa on a one-way mission to support the defenders, intending to beach itself and use its heavy guns. U.S. aircraft intercepted and sank Yamato before it arrived, sending 3,000 crew members to their deaths. Back on Okinawa, U.S. troops regrouped in late May and launched assaults on the most formidable Japanese positions yet. Relentless rain turned the battlefield into a quagmire, severely hampering movement and operations for both sides, but especially for the vehicle-dependent Americans 5. The U.S. attempted to outflank the Japanese stronghold at Suri, but Central defenders held firm. Intense clashes erupted around Sugarloaf and Horseshoe Hills in the west, while Army units battled for Conical Hill in the east. Japanese defenders, often positioned on reverse slopes, inflicted heavy casualties as the weather further slowed the American advance. The rain and mud made the landscape nightmarish. Marine Eugene Sledge described the approach to Suri as the most ghastly corner of hell I'd ever witnessed, with water-filled craters and the bodies of fallen Marines lying half-submerged in the muck, weapons still in hand. The short distances favored Japanese defenders and limited U.S. artillery effectiveness. In response, U.S. troops employed flamethrower tanks, satchel charges, and napalm to clear out caves and bunkers. By late May, the Japanese eastern flank collapsed, and U.S. forces captured Naha. A Japanese airborne counterattack on May 25th was swiftly destroyed, and the defenders began to withdraw further south on May 29th. By this stage, around 62,500 Japanese and 5,300 American soldiers had died. As the Japanese retreated, they forced civilians to accompany them, while Home Guard units were ordered to slow the American pursuit. Okinawan civilians endured immense suffering during the battle. The Japanese partially evacuated the island and urged civilians to flee combat zones, but many stayed close to Japanese troops or were pressed into service as laborers, nurses, or in some cases, sex slaves. Intense Japanese propaganda led some Okinawans to take their own lives rather than face the Americans. At least 30 groups committed mass suicide, often under military supervision. On Karamurato alone, up to 700 civilians died by suicide. U.S. Corporal Dan Lawler remembered the deep mistrust among Okinawan civilians. "We gave them all some candy, but they still refused to touch it unless one of us ate some of it first. You could tell they didn't trust us as far as they could throw us." The presence of civilians in the combat zone further complicated the Marines' advance, as many were unaccustomed to fighting in such conditions. Their shoot first, ask questions later approach often led to tragic mistakes, with families hiding in caves being killed and others shot as suspected infiltrators. The Japanese army even exploited civilians like the teenage Oshiro Kenki, using them to cover retreats and carry out suicide attacks. We had no idea where the Japanese army was. They simply abandoned our student group. We were handed grenades and told not to use them until we could see the whites of the Americans' eyes, he recalled. By early June, the Japanese position was dire. Only about 30,000 troops remained, many wounded. The survivors withdrew to the Kion Peninsula, preparing for a final stand. On June 4th, Marines launched a shore-to-shore assault on the Japanese naval base at Oroku. As exhaustion and combat fatigue mounted, U.S. commanders attempted unsuccessfully to persuade the Japanese to surrender. Fierce close-quarters fighting erupted around Kunishi Ridge, where the Japanese achieved a last significant victory on June 18th, killing Lieutenant General Buckner, commander of the U.S. 10th Army. Despite this, the outcome was effectively sealed. By June 21st, U.S. tanks closed in on the Japanese 32nd Army headquarters, Ushijima ordered a suicide charge from the command post, intending to witness it before committing ritual suicide himself. As communications faltered, many Japanese officers followed suit with suicide attacks. In the early hours of June 23rd, Ushijima and a heavily intoxicated Cho ended their lives. Cho penned a final poem. "The devil foe tightly grips our southwest land. His aircraft fill the sky. His ships control the seas. Bravely we fought for 90 days inside a dream. We have used up our withered lives, but our souls race to heaven." Except for a few isolated holdouts, the Battle of Okinawa concluded, mostly by June 22, 1945. This battle ranks among the deadliest for the U.S. military in World War II, with 3,000 Marines, 4,600 Army soldiers, and 4,900 sailors killed. Of the roughly 100,000 Japanese troops, 66,000 died, and half of the survivors were wounded. Civilian death estimates vary widely, with some figures reaching as high as 140,000, about one-third of Okinawa's native population. Despite the staggering losses, the Japanese strategy proved one of their most effective in the war, wearing down U.S. resources and morale, leaving many veteran soldiers psychologically drained. The 82-day conflict offered a grim preview of what an invasion of Japan's home islands might entail: a mobilized civilian population fighting fiercely on familiar ground, entrenched in prepared defenses, driven by fanaticism and willingness to die. U.S. planners applied the so-called Okinawa rate to estimate potential casualties in such an invasion, projecting up to 1 million American killed and wounded. Meanwhile, President Harry Truman received reports that some Japanese officials might be open to surrender, and that powerful new atomic bombs would soon be ready. Historians continue to debate the battle's impact, but many argue that the horrific toll at Okinawa influenced Truman's decision to deploy atomic weapons barely a month later. As we reflect on the staggering sacrifices and fierce determination displayed during the Battle of Okinawa, we must ask ourselves, what lessons can we draw from such a harrowing chapter of history? How can understanding these moments shape the way we approach conflict, peace, and the value of human life today? If this story moved you, inspired you, or made you think deeply, please take a moment to like this video and share it with others, because remembering history is the first step toward building a better future. Don't forget to subscribe for more powerful stories that challenge and enlighten. Together, let's keep the conversation alive.